You are tuned in to the Global Perspectives on Digital Health podcast. My name is Shubs Upadhyay, physician working in digital health. I'm keen to learn more about the issues, challenges, and successes where digital health can have a real impact for underserved communities around the world. If you're a founder, investor, donor, researcher, or are developing and implementing digital health anywhere in the world, and you're keen to break out of your bubble, join me as I speak to experts and innovators and get a truly global perspective on digital health. Stephen, it is so great to have you on the Global Perspectives on Digital Health podcast. Can you start maybe by telling the audience a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. It's great to be here. Shubs and we are friends, former colleagues, work together at Ada Health, and lots of conversations there. When I moved on from Ada Health, I moved to be a professor of medical device regulatory science. I would kind of see this role as regulatory and implementation science. I don't really see a separation between the modern view of what regulation is in the digital health space and the question of implementation. So my work spans across implementation. And before I worked with you at Ada Health, I worked at a med tech company called Biotronic in Berlin. That was in the area of internal defibrillators, implantable cardiac monitors, pacemakers, etc. And I worked in clinical regulatory for the implantable closed loop variety of digital devices. Before that, I was in academia, and way back, I'm a veterinary surgeon by training. So
I think there's two main areas I'd love to get into in our conversation today. One is the bigger kind of regulatory picture. Maybe we can touch on that briefly at the beginning. And then maybe we can get into the health tech assessment, clinical outcomes, economic evaluation, and the challenges. Because as I understand, you've done some work with health systems, with governments on how they can get this right. I think that's a particular area of interest here, where we're focused on low resource settings as well. So it'd be really, really good to kind of hone in your insights into what you've learned from those types of conversations that could be applied in these other contexts as well. So on that, Stephen, regulation, global picture, where are we at?
It's a very interesting time to work in AI and medical device regulation. So I sometimes have a slide that I show in quite a lot of my slide decks, which is sometimes that I think people think regulation is quite boring, and they kind of groan, and many other kind of professors jokingly or not very jokingly say to me, well, I'm glad you're working on that. I'm glad I'm not. And sometimes they're professors of clinical AI or professors of physics of AI, mathematics of AI, or other aspects of technology development. And that's kind of seen as the sex areas of technology, and anybody who's intersecting with regulation, that's the kind of boring aspects. It's all paperwork. It's kind of paper pushers. And I like to show this kind of carousel or mosaic of slides, actually images I've taken from leading newspapers, mostly the Financial Times. And it just has the title, We're Living in Interesting Regulatory Times. And it shows a lot of discussion over large language models, over OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google, and some of the figures within those countries. And all of these articles are about regulation of AI, and particularly regulation of AI in healthcare. We're really living through a period of a year and a half where AI aspect of digital regulation is front page news. So it's an interesting time to work in the space. I have a slightly odd position within the regulatory discussion because I'm an academic professor, and you tend to get a very polarized argument, sometimes coming from the regulatory community, which is kind of, well, everything already exists, and everything already exists in a perfect form. You know, it's nothing is new under the sun. It's a question of taking a new technology and applying the rules. A little bit like the obvious analogy that I always use for this is Moses has carried down the regulatory rules from Mount Sinai and presented them as tablets of stone, and we only need to read them, read the works of scripture and the tablets of stone, and we have the answers to every possible question of the future. And then on the opposite extreme, you kind of have the perspective that nothing is there. Literally, that nothing is there. So you repeatedly read in the newspapers and in blogs and in LinkedIn and numerous sources that there is no regulation of health, and how should we regulate this space? And we need to start from the absolute beginning because nothing is there. And of course, neither of these things is true. Of course, we don't have perfect systems to regulate futures which we did not anticipate. And often we're extending principles from very far in the past, from very different types of devices to the current. And it's also true that we don't have nothing and that we have no foundations. And you could say that's the boring middle ground. For me, it's the most exciting middle ground, because within how you actually get bringing in future perspectives, future approaches, adapting regulatory frameworks to what's needed for the future, and taking in the best of what's currently developed and adapting that, there is really very, very interesting thought processes and development of thought and interaction in this space.
So your message is regulation is sexy. Do you have a slide saying, I am passionate about regulation? Maybe you'd be the only person in those communities.
I definitely wouldn't be the only person to be passionate about regulation. So people can get very, very engrossed in the topic within the regulatory community. But sometimes those very same people can be highly, highly conservative. And there can, unfortunately, be sometimes a line of kind of patronizing, like telling the rest of the world that they're wrong. Now, some of that is inevitable, because within the world of regulation, there is an aspect of a policing role. It is, it's a checkpoint. So, of course, an aspect of this thinking can come in, and it's inevitable. It's impossible to completely avoid that. But at the same time, like me, I'm probably the humblest individual you've ever encountered, Shubs. So,
The humblest ever.
yeah. So there is room for listening and learning, particularly within the area of how regulation is developed for the future, and to stand back and actually ask the higher level question: is it actually right and fit for purpose? Not making an argument into the future that it must. There's another major problem with regulation, which is very much talked about also in the media, which is the kind of bottleneck effect of regulation. And there can be a kind of attitude from the community, which is, and so it should be, we're there as to slow down progress, in the manner that we should only be allowing through the bottleneck, wouldn't use the word bottleneck, but through the approval process, those technologies which are safe for market. So inevitably, there's a huge crowd of technologies wanting to come through, and the responsible valve controlling what's flowing through, and then letting, as a very responsible function of making sure what gets through is safe. I think one's perspective on that way of functioning of the regulatory system slightly has to be looked at from the perspective of what's the need. So in COVID, it became a very, very controversial point over COVID vaccination. So clearly we faced a situation where there was an absolutely enormous world need on the side of vaccination, but also in the terms of medical devices. And during COVID, we did see a relaxation of certain regulatory rules. There wasn't a complete relaxation saying, regulation no longer applies. There was a considered analysis of the challenges of the situation and of responses from regulators and from legislators, even in certain cases, to reevaluate what the right balance was in that situation. And there is an expectation for digital health and digital medicine. And I would actually take this maybe as a useful example, the OECD meeting. A major focus of that meeting, I think it was in February this year, could have the month wrong. January, was on digital health aspects of participative healthcare. This was a meeting with the heads of the heads of the departments of health of numerous countries, occupying two massive rows along the front of the meeting, and the panelists on stage dominated by the heads of ministers of health from many OECD countries. Actually, stating that on a policy level from countries, digital health solutions interacting with other aspects of workflows are actually being seen as a critical aspect of future health delivery, both in prevention and in treatment of the disease. Now, that is a situation that requires an enormous step up of what's being delivered within this space. And that requires a cooperative and proactive response from regulators to ensure that that can be delivered. So it's not a kind of vain hope. We cannot afford healthcare in the developed countries, nor in lower income countries without that step up. It's a core part of policy, certainly for the OECD, and one could say worldwide, and the World Health Organization is quite good at recognizing this, and that's got a responsibility that goes with it. And it's not the same as to say, there may be a slightly better version of a drug against this chronic condition that may slightly improve a very small, make a very small delta in the overall healthcare delivery system. It's anticipated and hoped and needed that you get massive change in healthcare delivery associated with digital health. Therefore, the systems developed need to acknowledge that in all of their aspects. Now, often when I say those kind of things, sometimes people can kind of see me as, one of the drinkers of the Kool-Aid, those that are naively thinking digital systems can transform care systems. They have no idea about how care systems function. I'm not talking about that from that level. I'm not even saying it's my perspective. It actually is my perspective. I'm saying it is the perspectives of very many governments, an acknowledgement, and of organizations like the OECD, that there is a need to get those systems to work because we face problems in paying for current health systems, problems of demographics, which are, we would state them, they're that obvious, and cross-sectional problems of a mismatch between expectations and delivery on our current system, and with increasingly staff unhappy working within healthcare systems and difficulty in recruiting staff.
What are you saying is regulation's place in this?
I'm saying that regulation needs to actually very, very much make itself functioning to the task that's in front of it. There's a task in front of healthcare and health policy, and regulation needs to be absolutely ready to step up to the plate, to be fit for purpose for the size of the task.
You talked earlier about a spectrum in terms of people's position. You mentioned the two extremes and the reality being in the middle. Countries, regulatory bodies within those, or policymakers, will have different places they are on this spectrum. What causes a variability of people's stances in this spectrum?
Unfortunately, so some of this is highly controversial. There can be a high degree of conservatism within the system. So there's a temptation, if you're put in a situation where you're responsible for the approval and the safety of a tool, in the end, you know that if things go wrong, it will end up back on your desk. And the pressure against flexibility, it almost sounds like the flexibility is a wrong term within this space. I would argue that it's absolutely not the wrong term.
Can you define flexibility in this context?
I mean, in a very broad sense. If we're maybe we'll get into later in the call, we're going to talk about this with very specific examples. But I think at the moment I would keep it relatively broad. One could always impose more stringent requirements, a further list of checklists, very, very strict observation of exactly one way which it must be done, and no dialogue across the regulatory approval system. If you're not approving things in the past in certain parts of the regulatory approval system, you're probably within your own role and your own job, less feeling that you're exposed than if you are approving things. Once something is approved on the market, if it's got a reasonable benefit risk ratio, it will bring benefits to patients, but it wasn't on the market before, and people aren't really looking at the benefit it brought either to the healthcare system or to the individual patients. What will come back and bite you? You will not get many letters in the regulator in the post saying, "Thank you, regulator. You approved this new device. It's been really transformational in the management of my diabetes." You won't get the thanks. You will only get the situation where it turns out that patients died or were damaged by the device. And therefore, that can induce a form of thinking which is in not facilitating, where sometimes facilitating is needed. Now, I would balance that, and we come back to maybe getting into some more detailed examples of this, to say that the challenge in regulatory science is actually getting both things to work together. So getting the incentives right in the system, where people are not only concerned about will it come back to bite me if it turns out to be a problem, but there is actual working together, acknowledging that the benefits are needed, because the regulation is about benefits and risks. It is written into the regulations, but the focus can then be overly on the risks. Now, of course, the risks need to be modified, and I think the increasing acknowledgement across all regulatory systems and all aspects of all countries of the world, that the importance of measuring risks and particularly observing risks in the wild, post-market surveillance, real-world performance monitoring, etc., are a critical part to that. Maybe I could give a very high-level example of flexibility in regulatory systems, which is slightly different than maybe examples we'll get to later, which is the area of decision support. So clinical decision support. And I always kind of give this example because it's a situation where it gives stark differences between different regulatory approaches. And none is absolutely right or wrong. The stances come from US Congress. So US Congress passed something called the 21st Century Cures Act, often abbreviated to the Cures Act. And that looked at modern information communication technology around hospitals, and it looked at electronic health record systems as a very, as kind of a foundational set of technologies, amongst other things. And it was, it kind of is in the title, 21st Century Cures Act. It was looking at approaches that could come in medicine that were in the 21st century, but not in centuries before. And it made certain decisions about not regulating as medical devices certain sets of decision support technologies which assisted doctors making decisions around the electronic health record. So it's a bit broader than that, but that's effectively the juice of the decision made by Congress. Congress is the body that should be making these decisions, and then it's up to the regulators to implement these decisions. That's how it works. And it's a very bold decision from Congress, and it sets out that a whole series of devices are not devices at all. So a whole series of decision support systems are not devices at all. Now, it's not all. Sometimes people talk about US clinical decision support systems as if they're not highly regulated. Some are highly regulated and some are not. But the groups that are not are really very expansive, provided they fit certain criteria. The FDA has set out a series of criteria for this. So they have to have approaches to avoid automation bias. They have to be not for emergency situations. They have to have a level of clinical evidence that supports their use, and that can be interpreted. They have to provide the basis on which decisions are made, and they can't interpret image and signals. So that's effectively the list. I could be missing one off when I'm trying to recount them in live time in this video call. Now, the effect of that is to create what I always describe as a 100-fold difference between the US regulation of this space and the European regulation of this space. All of those clinical decision support systems, they provide clinical decision support around, effectively, as they're set out of these use cases, you'll see in the US FDA clinical decision support guidance, if you read it, are around the area of diagnosis and therapy of disease, sometimes of prognosis. But these would all be classified as Class 2A devices in a European context and would have to go through an incredibly rigorous process of the regulatory quality management system approval, the provision of clinical data, clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance for clinical evidence. Now, in the US side, they don't. And of course, you could get disparate opinions. In the end, the US decision is actually flexible in the sense of saying we monitor the degree to which the systems fall within or without this category. We can even monitor overall the effect that decision from Congress has on the entire market. Congress can step in and make a change. You could even have a situation even in a short term of an executive order example, as an example, if there was a major problem in that. So it's not fixed for all time, but it is a highly flexible approach. You don't get much more flexible than that, which allows a massive experimentation and flexibility room within that space in the US. And you can kind of say that's wrong. You shouldn't have a flexible space around things that are about supporting decisions of healthcare professionals. We should be clear, healthcare professionals are always in the loop by definition. They're not direct-to-patient tools. They're with a qualified healthcare professional taking this information in and being in a situation where they can survey it and make decisions on it. That is actually saying, well, let's be highly flexible and observe how that works. If they were assuming that the FDA surveys this properly, if we were starting to see signs of a very major problem, I'm actually confident in the US system they could step in and stop that. But it's a question of looking. You can't, of course, do it without looking. Now, you could say, well, the manufacturers aren't tasked with looking because they're not a medical device. They can do that if they choose to. But other organizations are tasked with looking, so including healthcare professionals. And I have a lot of my current work on actually suggesting approaches that can be used even if you're not under a formal post-market surveillance. If you take the other approach, which is the European approach, there is almost no room for experimentation and for developing out of that sector. And you could kind of always take a conservative and safety first argument. We shouldn't be taking any chance with even a single patient. We should always make sure, absolutely sure, we've tested everything, we've risk assessed it, we've got the clinical data, then we make a cold and calculated decision based on the evidence, and we decide what can move forward. And then the manufacturer can submit a revision, and we make a cold and calculated and time, a decision taking time over the next change. But none of the interactions of what I describe as kind of a living laboratory of the country can actually happen. If one looked upon it from an industry perspective, let's say we have Europe wanting to build out an industry of clinical decision support systems, and we have America, US, wanting to build out, and actually Canada as well in this case, because they pretty much adopt the US system deliberately, right into their guidelines. So we're effectively adopting the US CDS guidelines. You compare those two ecosystems, you have, I describe it as a 100-fold difference, but it could be 1,000-fold difference. You have the ability to create new things in one, whereas you are tied down and very limited on your cooperation to create new things in the other. Now, it's not to say that one is moving and the other's not. Both are moving. One is moving very, very, very slowly. The other is moving 1,000-fold faster.
Super interesting. And I like how you frame this initially for what it all falls down to is kind of the benefit and risk. And I just wanted to call out again, that's really interesting that the way that the conversation goes sets certain people up to skew towards being very risk averse. Like, I don't want something coming back to my desk. So that's very interesting. And it seems that what you've weaved into that with the FDA approach is they have some ways to be flexible and therefore not be so risk averse, but have some kind of mechanism that you seem to be confident in that allows them to catch things before they kind of mushroom out of control.
True. And it does shift responsibility. Now, who does it shift the responsibility to? In the end, it shifts the responsibility to the physician. Now,
that's telling.
That you're a physician. I'm a veterinary physician. I've done lots of clinical work, but in a different nature. And I don't compare the two natures. It's relevant to my work and my thinking, but it's not the same nature. But would it not depend on the type of clinician you are and where you see the role of the clinician in the future, how comfortable you are with being in a situation that you have to, in your work, ensure that you're not succumbing to automation bias? And there's a whole complicated science and paradoxes of explainability in that, but also making choices based on information which is provided to you from AI systems. Where
100%.
Support systems aren't solely AI systems, but in reality, increasingly, these are AI systems.
Earlier, you talked about the convergence of regulation around drugs and medical devices, and I almost feel there's this like other third gravity center coming in, which is medico-legal and regulation of like clinician decision making, which is all kind of coming and being welded into this equation as well. So I think that's super interesting. You promised us your stance as well, and maybe you could put it in the context of, hey, I'm a health system decision maker in a low income setting. I'm looking at what's going on. I see these different natures of risk averseness and these different flavors I have. How might you advise them to approach it?
So the question in short is where I am on this spectrum regarding decision support systems specifically. So I think there's very much that's right with the current US approach. Particularly if we take the FDA line on the US on the interpretation of the 21st Century Cures Act. So very much which is right about that. But I do think that should be more formal processes of monitoring of the market from the regulator side, what the regulator actually has to do, and it should be set out what they will do in terms of their side of checking the market. And I think it should also be more formally set out what the healthcare systems have to do to monitor within their own domain of the market, so the other side. And also, it should be compulsory to build into tools approaches for feedback. So I'm doing a huge amount of work on this, and it's very controversial. But it's not the same as post-market surveillance. Post-market surveillance means the manufacturer is given or has the responsibility from a regulatory setting to gather data. And this is a bit different. I'm saying there should be approaches built into tools which allow feedback from clinicians, and not to the manufacturer, but also to the system, to the healthcare system, to the regulators. And I actually don't think that's challenging. And I think it's such a statement of the obvious that I'm slightly surprised that when I tell people about it or submit papers on it, people are somewhat surprised by it as a suggestion. It's just a statement of the obvious.
So you're saying that clinicians, clinician end users, patient end users should be very, very, very easily able to feedback any type of feedback to
Absolutely.
health system bodies and regulatory bodies. I mean, we have that in drugs, right? We have
yes,
that in the yellow card reporting.
So I mentioned, so we're likely going to fill a full hour of the podcast on this one starting theme, and I'm very happy to do so. So I would actually argue that yellow card reporting is not that. And also that for drugs, for non-digital drugs, it's actually quite hard. Like maybe I'm asking a revealing question, but how many times did you fill out a yellow card? So I always
very often. Yeah.
I actually had access to them at the back of the formulary. I was working in veterinary medicine, but the system was exactly the same. I'll be perfectly honest, I never filled out a single one. I think I got a card out to fill out, and then I was distracted with my clinical.
And that's only one type of feedback, right? That's like an incident or like something bad, like an adverse effect. Whereas you're talking about the full spectrum.
Full spectrum, and with drugs, which if we're not talking about the next generation of digitally supported drugs, and we're just talking about traditional drugs, you have to tear out the page, find time to fill it out, find an envelope, find a stamp, write the letter, remember not to let it fall out of your pocket and actually put it in the post box. And how often is it done? It's not done. You can't do anything about drugs. So people have created online portals, which allow doctors to report information of the yellow card online, but they're not very used. Do you even know what the portal address is? Type in HTTP, whatever, try and find it. The advantage of digital technologies is it's there by default. We both worked in the area of consumer-based tools in the area of symptom checking, etc. Now there you have, whether the manufacturer likes it or not, whether the developer likes it or not, on the app stores, you can provide feedback as a user and you can provide a star rating. All I'm suggesting is a star rating and a feedback rating fit for the mid-21st century for the digital technologies we're building out, and that is in the public domain. And is that so shocking? Would you get nonsense? Of course you get a degree of nonsense. Are there ways of filtering out nonsense? Yes, there are.
You've worked on this. You've worked on evaluating effectiveness of, for example, even within ADA, within a low resource setting in Tanzania and South Africa. Can you kind of just broadly outline where are the biggest challenges when we're thinking about evaluation and getting a return on the investment?
Okay, so I'll maybe answer the question from a very slightly different perspective than you ask it. Your question is about the biggest challenges and where we're falling down. I'll give an angle, so kind of Stephen's angle on challenges we should address. And there's something which is I've recently become interested in. So it comes from the work of actually some other researchers in the US academic and law side of regulation and some of the groups which are in collaboration with the FDA University Centers for Regulatory Science. So it's not a completely new concept, but it's to explore with AI and with digital health the extent to which we're talking more about systems and interaction, holistically interacting units, rather than discrete devices. And just to explore what I mean by this a little bit and see where it goes to and what the implications are for regulation and for health technology assessment. So I was interested in this. I've been interested in this for 3 or 4 years, but particularly I started working in a Horizon grant, which is in the area of health technology assessment quite recently. And I have a module which looks at what if the thing we're trying to measure is not like a drug. So the health technology assessment of medical devices has really dealt with them as if they're drugs. They're discrete things for treating a certain defined target population, which can be quite broad, usually for a very defined indication, and they can quite easily be measured. Did they work or did they not work? Were they better than alternatives? Were they not better for alternatives? Were they, given the degree to which they're better than alternatives, worth the additional money with respect to those alternatives? What if digital health technologies are not like drugs? That's the starting point for this conversation. So it started with that, with a really good new PhD student that I've had for about 9 months, really exploring this space and looking into the extent to which digital medical devices are like drugs and the extent to which they're not like drugs. And if they're really not like drugs, we have to accept that they're really not like drugs in everything we do with them. If we treat them like drugs when they're not, we make them like drugs. I'll get back in more detail on that. And we started working on a series of papers on this. There's actually 3 in the series now, but there's more. There's 4. But there's 2 of them which are about to be published. The first of these papers will be published on the 18th of June next week.
We'll link that in. Yeah. Okay.
So it may be maybe not next week when this goes live. It may already have been published, so people can look it up. It's in Nature Portfolio Journal's Digital Medicine, and it's about suites or groupings of digital devices. And at the very same time as we were working on this paper, the FDA commissioner made a statement at a conference in Las Vegas to the tech world, actually describing suites of devices. And that, to kind of paraphrase him, and it's hard to paraphrase him, but he basically says, if we acknowledge that increasingly digital health tools include ranges of sensors and different devices which are grouped flexibly together, we need to develop regulatory approaches that acknowledge the fact that they are flexible groupings of devices. And that's what the title of our paper is about. It's a series of 2, one looking more at the problem and one looking more at potential solutions, so that we don't pretend to have solved all problems. It's more of a starting point. So the FDA Commissioner, Robert Califf, just in terms of his background, so the FDA Commissioner is actually kind of a political appointment to some extent, but he had served as FDA Commissioner for one period of time for a number of years, and then he left the role, and he actually went and worked for Google Alphabet for 5 years, within their health and suites of different sensor devices and interaction probably with Fitbit and Verily and Google Health aspects. And then he left that role and he returned to the FDA for a second role as FDA Commissioner. So it kind of explains part of his thinking. So you could say that's a very bad thing. He's been influenced by Google and now he's thinking like Google. Depends on one's perspective in the world. I would say that's probably quite a good thing, where you bring somebody back from one of the world's leading companies overall, and you have them in a position where they're actually then responsible for regulation. I'm more concerned about the other direction of the revolving door than the revolving door back to regulation.
So I just wanted to clarify that what you're saying. Then I'm going to frame this just from a developer's perspective, right? I'm a founder, or I'm working in a software development company. My intended use is on a small part of a patient journey or a clinical workflow, but within a suite of products. There's others as well within this suite. Mm-hmm. And we're all contributing to enabling this journey and this workflow. Am I on point here so far?
So you are, and there's nothing within current regulatory regimes which would stop you doing this, but they would make it very, very hard for you to do. And that's what Robert Califf, the Commissioner of the FDA's point, is about. Under FDA regulations and under European regulations, there's such a thing as systems of medical devices. And you could define an entire system, but you would be required under current regulations to really tie the system down, to be in control of many aspects of that system, and to have systems for the monitoring of that entire system and to clinical data on that system.
I see.
And it's there's a recent guidance from the kind of medical device coordination group for the European level on how that how that will work. Let's say the parts of the system that you're interacting with are sensors within an Apple Watch or sensors within a worn activity sensor. There are ways you can do it, but they're extremely restrictive. And so that would be the kind of conservative side of regulation would say we have it already. I'm kind of glad the FDA commissioner is asking the question, do we really have it already and already have it right such that it's functioning for the future world that we're seeing? If we get back to the kind of the suites in terms of how the paper presents it, because probably it's a way of answering the question. We set out in the paper a description of what groupings of devices look like. And I'll take just, we have many examples of groupings of devices, but one that really illustrates the point quite well is sets of devices for monitoring in the home. Okay. So you can have sets of devices in monitoring in the home for the situation of chronic disease monitoring. So let's take as an example the patient with type 2 diabetes. And they could have a series of devices, including continuous glucose measurement devices, including in some cases automatic devices for medication delivery, or even things like pill boxes. They could include monitoring approaches, but they're focused, and they can include things like digital scales, etc. But they're focused around care provision in a chronic care setting. And then if we take another set of devices, so sometimes those are really not linked together, though they should be, and sometimes they're linked together in kind of a care package, which is put together as a kind of system. Another example, which is a recently very well-known system, is the hospital at home. So sometimes kind of described as a virtual ward, and this is very, very well known within the UK and also the US and Switzerland and Australia, some other countries. Let's say the patient with respiratory disease, for the sake of argument, it could be COVID, but it could also be some other form of acute exacerbation of a respiratory condition. But this COVID example is quite fresh in people's mind and is quite useful, but doesn't solely apply there. So you have a situation where the patient is admitted, they're an inpatient in hospital, they've been under monitoring, but they are released early to home in a virtual ward in a situation that without digital support, they would still be in the hospital. So it's an alternative for the ongoing relatively acute care. It's not intensive care, but it's relatively high-level care because that is delivered by a series of digital interacting technologies. And those include telemedicine platforms, approaches for teleconsultation, remote monitoring technologies which are measuring breathing, technologies which are measuring oxygen saturation, etc., and can include things like pill boxes and so on, for monitoring the delivery of treatment, and can include or often include then actual visits from doctors, so there's human in the loop. Now, those are two sets of different technologies. They actually have a different target population, and they have an absolutely different clinical indication, and they're in very high different levels of risk. But they have overlapping sets of individual technologies in them. So they're kind of a super suite. They're a suite of, made up of a superintended purpose. Each of those devices has a subintended purpose, and they're being grouped together. Now, within current technologies, for example, the British Telecom have a partnership with the NHS and various startups to deliver a hospital at home. Within current technologies, those are, pretty much a medical device system, not necessarily regulated exactly within that framework, and certainly not during COVID, but they are predefined and they've got relatively narrow sets of devices. We're increasingly entering a world in the future where that model just does not make sense. Like, are you going to have a series of different watches, a series of different sensors that you wear? You're already under the diabetes program. You're already in chronic monitoring. You've got perfectly good sensors on your arm. Do you throw out one watch and put on another sensor watch? Or do you increasingly build sets of technology around frameworks that use and reuse appropriate devices within those frameworks? And one can always say, well, that's possible under current regulation. Actually, that's another way of saying it's not possible under current regulation. We give you a series of requirements under regulation you could never meet, therefore it's not possible. And that kind of goes back a little bit to this argument about the role of the regulator. The role of the regulator is not to say, well, yeah, you can do that, but you can't secretly. Of course, we all know you can't, but you'd have such a hard job doing it, it would never get there. Is actually to find means of facilitating that. Like, in the nature of time, I'll maybe roll on to another paper that I actually have under review at the moment, but it's in progress, I mentioned the FDA moving relatively fast in this space and taking it relatively or very seriously the responsibility to this space. And something that's very impressive in my mind, how it will work is a different question, is the FDA about 2 months after, a month and a half after Robert Califf, the commissioner's statement, obviously he's making a statement, he's got something in his mind. The FDA launched a health at home initiative and hub where they actually set out to investigate exactly this scenario. So it's really the use of devices in the home, around the home, and actually exploring the home environment. And it's quite interesting as a document because it's on the FDA website. It was mid-April, I think it was launched. But if you look in the document, it mentions the word equity 9 times in the document. In the title, equity is there, and right through the document, equity is there. And that's slightly unusual in my view from the FDA and from a regulator. You could kind of say, well, what's the regulator got to do with equity? The regulator should be ensuring safety. Let other people concern themselves with equity. But it's actually a very bold vision. What they're saying is that acknowledging we have a societal responsibility. Healthcare provision at the moment may not be perfect. It is not perfect. It's clearly not equitable. There are very large problems. There are problems of affordability. Acknowledging that digital technologies have a huge ask of them, but also in parts of their launch document, they acknowledge that they're failing to deliver these responsibilities to an extent, and that this failing of systemic level planning, it's actually kind of saying we're going to come in as a regulator and try and get the system to function, because current regulations don't promote that. The current line of individual device regulations don't actually get these things to work well together. They actually are more likely to get individual islands, and the individual islands are actually restrictive to a future which would involve more holistic, sensible, and rational healthcare.
We started in talking about evaluating effectiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
We started talking about how do you see that this has created a benefit. And so what I've taken away from what you've said is that the way we think about evaluation is in these islands. So
Mm-hmm.
I've got a very narrow intended benefit area, because that's as a developer, that's in my sphere of control. And I'm kind of thinking about this metric and this specific outcome and how I might contribute to it. And then we extrapolate some other kind of benefits around that. And then you make a case for, on the benefit risk ratio that you talked about. Okay, here's the benefits I've created. And they're usually quite small because you have to focus on your locus of control. And what you're saying is actually, we need to think about these tools in the context of the bigger system and how they interact, not as islands, but kind of the bigger piece.
Yeah.
And then how is then the whole piece contributing to the bigger outcomes that are needed?
Exactly. So that's true. Like within the regulatory system, your notified body wants you to have an ultra simple device. And regulation goes partly towards asking for that, but the notified body really are much more comfortable the simpler the picture they're given to. They're really quite awkward if you don't give them a simple picture. Within the DIGA framework, at least let's say the pre-update DIGA framework, because there's current
DIGA, just to check if people are not familiar, DIGA is the reimbursement framework or the health technology assessment framework within Germany, right?
It's a fast track specific health technology framework in Germany for apps in medical care. There's a separate program for those in kind of elderly care and kind of the care setting, but this is in the medical setting. And it was specifically designed, and it could come across as being a bit overcritical. It was way ahead of its time in many ways of having a fast track, which would allow apps to get reimbursed before there was very, very hard evidence. But what it did in order to get to that point was to actually say, is to start from the metric, to start from the simplicity in the metric. Effectively, they said you must be simple and you must be measurable, and that's the only thing we'll accept. So really narrowly defined target population, really narrowly defined ICD-10 codes that you address, setting out a framework of how you're going to demonstrate a positive care advantage within those narrow terms. Now that's fine as a program as long as you accept the consequences of it as a program. I'm speaking entirely with hindsight, so it's unfair always, 2020 vision of hindsight. What you get is what you allow to be created, and what you get is what you're regulated for. You kind of deserve what you get, speaking with hindsight.
And what did Germany get with DIGA?
Well, you get a series of solutions. It was also a requirement, I should say, that there was this idea that this is the first version of DIGA, there is updates to the system, that you had to have systems which actually had relatively minimal physician in the loop. And what you get with this is not to say that none of the solutions have value, but they are narrow, they're not well integrated, and they are not holistic things. You kind of look at DIGAs and say you're entirely wrong, because look, here's an example of 57 different products, and they're all nothing like the things you're talking about, Stephen. The reason they're nothing like the things I'm talking about is because they're artificially walled off and separate. They have to be that, or else they couldn't get funded. The French have the advantage of developing their system after having looked at the German system and it's run for a while, and it's not massively different, but there are two important points that I would pull out of the PCAN system in France, which give me hope that we don't purely develop solutions in an island and we think more about how they interact within the healthcare system. One is an acknowledgement of co-design, that there's actually co-design within healthcare systems. And the other is an acknowledgement of embeddedness within systems, that you're embedded within care. So that's a greater acknowledgement of interaction with physician in the loop, and a greater acknowledgement that it's not your system as an island, it's integrated. And within the German system is being revised. There's a new law which revises it, and there are also stepwise movements in that direction. Now, I can kind of understand the point of view that it must be measurable. It must be we must start from the metric. What can we measure to some extent? I'm kind of giving a radically different vision of this, which is to say what you actually want is not necessarily something which is easily measurable. You want something which is really, given the size of the problem, which is, I would go back to the OECD description of, what the ambition is for healthcare system delivery, is actually to acknowledge that that's not a one-step process. And also to acknowledge you're not going to do it from 50 or 500 different DIGAs, all operating in isolation to address one part of the healthcare system without really the physician in the loop. Just to me, that just from first principles would not get you very far. Highly controversially, I'm also somewhat skeptical about the value of a digital therapeutic on its own, so the purely digital approach to treatment. It doesn't involve a drug, doesn't involve a sensor in most cases, and doesn't involve a physician in the loop. I think there are examples of where that will provide utility, but I can hand on my heart say that most of what we will get in utility in clinical systems will not come from purely an isolation digital therapeutic. It will be much more from the combinations of that with physiotherapy, with a physician, can be to the extent an AI-assisted physiotherapist, and the combination with drugs. But these things aren't as an island. As a physician, let's say if you were dealing with a sports medicine case, I know you're not an expert in sports medicine, but would you ever really approach it like that and say, well, this patient needs an entirely digital solution? Do none of the no psychological aspects of this conversation with them. And we're absolutely not going to use any drugs because drugs are not part of our digital program. This patient is in the digital program. Why would you approach the patient that way? Surely you would say this is a patient, and the patient is holistic. They've got multimorbidity, they've got other conditions, they've got the situation they come from. I have an array of treatment approaches in front of me, and I'm going to have to get those to work together. And actually, controversially or not, when you combine those approaches together, you don't actually have a randomized controlled trial to say if I took drug 1 and drug 2, combined them with this suggestion of their diet and their exercise, that would all work together. So how can you do it without the randomized controlled trial to say that combination works? Now, within digital systems and digital tooling working together, there may be a situation where we need to reimburse combinations and settings where we don't always have the evidence in advance, and we don't have the specific evidence that set and combination will provide a positive healthcare advantage together. Kind of reminds me that I'm kind of jumping onto a next theme in terms of a very obvious statement about randomized control studies. Like you're probably aware of the it's Christmas edition of the BMJ, which
parachute.
The parachute example. Situation people jumping out and with and without parachutes. There was no difference in the randomized control study, but the plane hasn't left the ground. It's on its landing gear from memory. If it's not, that will do. That's a nice example of it. So the randomized control study, you didn't need it beforehand, but I could have got the example wrong. The point is that within current medical practice, there is application of common sense quite a lot, and there's not very good data recording and very good monitoring. One thing you have in digital technologies actually is a future where you can actually gather quite a lot of data. In many cases where the risk is low, we should be looking at gathering more data, including feedback data, and we should be more flexible in the use of technologies together. And there's some acknowledgement of that within the developing Pekin program. And the question was always is, should resource be put into that? Our healthcare system. The argument is always given, we need to be really, really careful. If we start putting money into digital solutions, we're already completely bankrupt. Our hospitals are, like Germany, there's already hospitals going bankrupt. We start diverting resource into this newfangled digital ideas, which might not really work, then we're going to be even worse. Now, my argument would be this is a completely wrong-headed thought process that makes that argument. Instead, you need higher level strategic thinking about where you want to get to. Where is the destination you want to get to? And actually, within the UK, I actually see much more of this than in other countries. Interesting, though, they don't have a kind of fast-track program. You have a definition of where you want to get to. And what
Can you give an example of what does that statement look like, where we want to get to?
So, for example, looking at a current model of care provision, so you actually set out, as a high-level policymaker and politicians to say, with medical experts, to actually say, how do we think we could actually deliver this service such that it's good, such that it's quality in the future? What would be the high-level, OKRs, KPIs, on terms of what the system delivery could be? How would we stepwise try and deliver this program of care? And then you promote and pay for, including through reimbursement program, if that's the route, or there's other ways you can do payment. We could discuss why payment is necessary from the state. That's because investment is necessary to get the thing you want to get, and there are different ways you can approach investment. You could approach investment such that you invest in technologies then will be run by the healthcare system. So you don't have private operators. You probably would almost certainly have private operators building many of them. Or you could have a situation where you build an ecosystem where there are continued private operators operating within that space. But you would set off from, saying, what do we need to create? And you would put money into your system to get there. And you would acknowledge that you need investment. You don't get something for nothing. You need to invest to get to that point. And it makes sense to invest to get to that point, because the point you would get to has advantages in care delivery. Of course, there are skeptics, but that doesn't really matter in terms of building out a policy for the future. You either say, well, there are skeptics who are not doing it. That's just mostly what most countries are doing at the moment. Or there are skeptics who accept their point of view, but in the end, we've been elected as a government, and this was set out as our manifesto vision, and we are working with the transformation unit within our system to deliver to these goals. And those goals acknowledge that there are multiple interaction component parts of that, but they're not all completely independent components. Within a certain model of that, you would have a reimbursement system, and that reimbursement system would not be devoid of having metrics, but the metrics would be sensible to what the holistic system should be moving towards. And within that, as you develop that system, you wouldn't have a static goal. You would be horizon scanning for technologies. And you would be looking at how you'd actually not even be only horizon scanning for them. You would be horizon building for them and saying our next step needs to be looking to incorporate those technologies, and the horizon scanning for saying a new technology is coming along, which we can incorporate, and we have a program for building that out in the future to bring that within our system.
And then you're saying that the way then you evaluate the effectiveness of that is not then making the person or the developer on that to be proving out a set of incremental gains, linking or seeing the connected dots between that tool being implemented into this connected system and showing that it's contributing to the overall metrics or the overall outcomes that you're going for. Is that what you're saying?
It only has an isolated and unique return of investment if it was an isolated and unique technology. And I would make the argument that many of these things are not. That's part of this discussion of interaction of systems and of suites of technologies. And the difficulty is if you try and make them that, you actually build this highly, highly inflexible system where you can't actually exchange components, where they aren't provided. The advantages of being provided by many different providers actually, there is a reason why, there's a very good reason why I have a Android phone in my pocket that interacts with a pair of Apple headphones, and you probably have a Apple phone in your pocket and interacts with some Samsung headphones. You could say that sounds highly inefficient. Why don't we have a single manufacturer? We could have a single manufacturer. They would make all of the technology, and that would be the optimum, most efficient world. Why don't we have that system within any of our technology fields? The alternatives of our current system, which is what is acknowledged in the FDA initiative on home health at the moment, and in Robert Califf's statements on this, is that you actually get quite restrictive, narrow individual use cases, which are probably safe but highly non-flexible, is one extreme, versus trying to imagine that you can pre-design absolutely everything. And that you kind of have to get this match between enabling aspects and advantages of individual market capitalist incentive to deliver aspects of solutions and laying down high-level interoperability requirements. Current regulatory and reimbursement systems do not support that, so that's kind of the problem statement. I'm very clear in the vision that they need to support that, because that's the only way you could actually get digital transformation in healthcare systems. Kind of run back to so many caveats to those that think digital transformation of healthcare systems is a folly, that it will not happen, and so on. I'm speaking from the positivist, convinced side. The way that we can get it to work is actually to acknowledge complexity in systems, and that we cannot know everything in advance, but we can measure what we're introducing, and not perfectly measure what we're introducing, but we can find ways of measuring through feedback, through analysis, through quality improvement approaches, which don't look at individual technologies. They're not run by an individual manufacturer, where their sole job is to show their technology is functioning. They're run across the system to say, what are we actually generating? And it will require investment. So it's quite high level, it's quite policy related, but I think it's stating many things which are just from first principles shown to be the case, if we step back a little bit from the problem.
Okay. So, especially for, if you're in policy or you're thinking about implementation and measuring effectiveness, particularly at health system or government level, like say, particularly in a low resource setting, you're observing what's happening in the rest of the world, as you've pointed out. I think one clear thing I hear is, number one, have a very, very clear idea of the transformation and the outcomes that you're trying to deliver over the long term. And then design the way you might be evaluating that to make sure that they're all tracking to those outcomes. And then create a system that allows for thinking about how, say, a private vendor is coming in or is interacting with the system in as a whole. So no device is an island, and the system is also not a passive entity in this, right? Then you're thinking about then how the system overall is benefited towards that goal that you've set out. Is that a good summary?
It's a summary, and I think it addresses this point that we've not really talked about low resource settings. I've actually mostly talked about high resource settings.
Yeah.
Low resource settings bring with them, many additional challenges we've not discussed for high resource settings, but sometimes they do have the advantage where you could be starting to really completely look again at how you would deliver care without having such established systems, also established in some ways in terms of built-in resistance to change, and actually be able to start off and say, how would we like our system to develop? Mm-hmm. And some of this acknowledgement that digital technologies are not things on their own. They interact with other digital technologies, they interact with your entire care provision, and actually thinking of what should your healthcare system delivery look like? And you may not be looking at all areas simultaneously. You may be taking certain areas where you would actually be targeting them and say that is a focus of our digital and our digital care delivery interacting with our doctor care delivery. My argument would be it doesn't make sense still to bring in a single sole provider to kind of deliver everything in your healthcare system. You certainly want to be in a situation where the architect of the healthcare system overall is either the country itself or how you split up into healthcare provision systems, but they shouldn't be digital companies providing a whole aspect of your care. Of course, there are some healthcare systems that really like to be taking on that role. I think it's going to be a question of digital systems delivering that alongside the doctor's care network. You need to set out acknowledging that investment is needed. The payback does not start from day one.
Yeah,
I would argue with you.
I mean, that's a really good message. There's lots of things banded around, this thing didn't achieve, 3 times ROI within a year, and really making sure you bake in the initial investment and ironing kinks out. That is just part of any intervention that will take time. I think you alluded to a good example.
I would argue that any effective intervention
takes time.
Caution the word any, because it's 100%, but almost all effective interventions will initially cost more rather than less. Because they will involve changing the nature of care. So you're providing more care where you were previously providing yet less, and it will cost more money, or changing the nature of your interactions with humans within your system and even with buildings within your system, etc. So they will initially cost more in almost all cases. I know that that's not a common message from the digital health industry or the tech industry in general, but I would make that argument that most things in the healthcare system will initially be more expensive before providing a dividend rather than less expensive.
Very good. Is there anything else that you want to kind of make sure you've spoken about, either in terms of like regulation or this kind of system-wide thinking of evaluation?
Talking about the interaction between regulation, health technology assessment, and funding policy makes it sound extremely high level. Like it's really OECD type stuff. It's normally, mere mortals aren't allowed to talk about this kind of thing because it can only be talked about by the, very, very refined group. So it's a kind of slightly conscious when I'm talking about it, that it can slightly come across that way. Who is he to be suggesting things are different or we could do things in a different way? Of course, some of it could be challenged. We're not putting numbers beside any of these things. In every single aspect of what I'd said, you could have somebody shouting at their TV screen or laptop screen or iPad screen, saying this is nonsense. I don't agree with these perspectives. I'd at least say that there's aspects to what I'm saying which are part of current regulatory thinking, current regulatory initiatives. Have a read of the papers and consider if there's any aspects of it which ring true to you. And there's certain aspects about acknowledging that we cannot have technology sets which are completely in islands, and that the pure question of interoperability, you can say, well, that's interoperability. It's not purely interoperability in the sense of the role of, SNOMED CT and
or FHIR or something.
FHIR and etc. That is about communications, and it's not about interactions to deliver an intended purpose for a medical device. So we're talking about wider implications of interoperability and the interoperability of achieving medical goals rather than interoperability of bytes. And for that reason,
I like that.
It's not simply interoperability. It's an implication once we have interoperability, or an implication of developing systems which would never actually be interoperable. Even if they were theoretically interoperable, they were all running, using FHIR servers and HL7 and et cetera. They still wouldn't be interoperable because they wouldn't be allowed to be interoperable.
One final question. Given the audience and kind of what this podcast tries to serve, you've also worked in, you talked about top-down policy stuff. You've also worked in bottom-up. You've worked in, with ADA. You've worked in implementing. You've been involved in, showing certain proof points and safety and quality on performance on evaluation. What's your advice to people who are developing digital health tools in LMICs in terms of creating real impact and the benefit? How should they be approaching evidence evaluation?
It kind of sounds quite glib and also maybe quite slightly naive. but build in proper feedback loops into your technology from the start anyway.
Feedback loops. Can you elaborate?
So, it's obviously something we've just talked about a huge amount in our past, but you want to have a situation where you don't need to plan a clinical investigation for 9 months and then have it running for 6 months in order to get feedback of how your tool is performing on the market. So, wherever it is possible and there are limitations, you should be within your own technologies building routes and building partnerships where you're getting continuous feedback on the performance of your tools. So either
feedback as
every interaction of your tool with a patient provides feedback, or at least a high proportion of representative interactions with your tool and the patient provides feedback. And there are various means in which you can do that.
And you said the clinicians sometimes as well, depending on where you are in the journey and the level of interaction.
Yeah, so it depends on the
clinician,
nature of the tool you have. So some tools like Digas that we mentioned before really don't have a physician in the loop, but that feedback can be coming from patients. So you say, what do patients know? Well, it's at least there can be highly relevant feedback in certain scenarios from patients. You don't want to be in a situation where, because you may not get every relevant feedback point from patients, you're not getting any relevant feedback points from patients. So that the very point of patient-reported experience measures, you want to be, you could have a situation where you kind of employ an external consultant to do kind of a usability, post-market evaluation, and you design a whole series of interviews, and you go through the GDPR process, even ethics approval if required in your own setting in order to get that data. Or you could be building approaches into your tools to actually get that feedback. Sometimes the monitoring, patient-reported outcomes, it may not be possible to fully separate outcomes which are not related to your device versus outcomes which are related to your device. But I would say having even outcome related to patient-reported outcomes. So sometimes that's built into tools. You're actually part of your tool is actually providing a patient-reported outcome. You should be looking at that data from the perspective of, does it give any signal, any early signal problem with my device? And if you can be in a situation where you have a consent-based partnership with the with a proportion of the patients and their healthcare provider, to actually then have, and I don't mean, I mean not building that on as you need it, but on the assumption you will need it, that everybody needs it. You build that into your solution as you roll it out to get feedback.
And your contracts with partnerships, right? And your contracts with a health system.
Yeah. But the important thing is, it's, most companies are doing that to a small degree and not systemically and not all the time. The point is to look at it the different way, that you always are building that in. You'd be surprised, you kind of say, you could take the perspective everybody's doing it, but you're surprised how many digital tools do not have easy functioning, always on loops to feedback on their products. And feedback becomes particularly important with the interaction, with different systems. So you need to have a range, not purely looking at one scenario, just looking at one use case of your tool, when you're actually maybe being used in entirely different use cases, for example, within these suites of where tools are put together, or within a different country, and you've got no feedback on that whatsoever. And as you bring in, all digital tools are changed, and sometimes they're not changed as much as they should be, because there's no feedback, there's no process to even monitor the effects of changes. You should be building that in as part of your planning for changes, so that you can monitor changes. And I have a paper actually that I published in this on the Mayo Clinic Proceedings Digital Health Journal that kind of discusses approaches even towards things like A/B testing within a framework where you're actually doing experiments, but risk-assessed experiments, where you're exploring different approaches to providing tools, but you have feedback to actually look at which was the better approach. That's not an irresponsible thing to do. It's actually a very responsible thing to do, provided you set a responsible framework of risk assessment, a regulatory correct procedure for change control. If your notified body needs to be informed, so be it. You following that process, and actually correctly monitoring data. Again, these things could be sometimes seen as this sounds not like a thing you'd be wanting to do with a regulatory device. It is, but you need to do it with a regulatory device in a way that is appropriate for a regulatory device.
So using feedback, of course, for monitoring how well you're doing. So not just the quantitative side, but really digging into the qualitative aspects of the feedback.
Both, and often they're mixed to a degree.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
questionnaire approaches which also have free text feedback. Free text feedback is clearly very, very challenging and time consuming to interpret, but it can be very powerful.
Very good. So use feedback, really like build that in. A good message to developers. Stephen, we've covered so much. You know, I think it's been useful to have your perspective in terms of regulation. How to approach evidence for effectiveness from a health system policy funder perspective, and also how to prepare yourself as a developer to kind of see what's going on in terms of these different spectrums around the health systems and governments you've had exposure to. And you know, if you're in policy or in a health system in a different part of the world, I think there's some really unique insights that you can take from Stephen here. Stephen, thank you so much for your time and insights. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.